Bun venit la Garantat 100%, domnului Alfie Kohn. Good evening and thank you for accepting our invitation.
My pleasure.
In order to make things very clear from the very beginning, which is the difference between conditional and unconditional parenting?
It begins from the premise that it's not enough to love one's child. Rather, what matters is how that love expresses itself. There's a difference between loving a child for who he is or who she is on the one hand, and for what he or she does on the other. When we love children for what they do, we say there are conditions, or as we say in English, there are strings attached,
right,
which means you have to earn the care or attention, the approval or acknowledgement that you get from a parent. And this turns out to be very destructive psychologically, even though it is precisely the kind of parenting recommended by many parenting advisors in order to control children.
Right.
But what children need is to be loved for no damn good reason. We need to love them for who they are, even when they screw up or fall short, maybe especially then.
Well, conditional parenting, in your view, is very similar to the free market mechanism. What will a child become after such a type of education?
Well, we don't have to speculate. We have a fair amount of research by now to indicate what happens. When children feel they have to earn their parents' love as if it is an economic transaction, they learn to accept themselves only conditionally. I am only a good person when I do well in school or in sports, when I hide my anger, when I'm nice to other people, when I'm attractive or funny or otherwise deemed more worthy. And psychologists tell us that unconditional self-esteem is practically the same as, or at least an important component of, psychological health. To be able to know that even when we make mistakes, we still have a core of faith in oneself. I'm still a competent and capable and lovable person. But when our parents put conditions on our worth, when we have to jump through hoops, as we say with animals, in order to get a prize, and here the prize is love, we come never to accept ourselves as ultimately good, because we're only one mistake away from thinking of ourselves as incompetent and unlovable. So the worst thing we can do to children is to use our love as a kind of trophy that we award to them when they please us or impress us. Instead, we need to give them the message, no matter what you do, even things I don't approve of, I will never, ever stop loving you.
Someone could ask, isn't this pure anarchy?
I don't see how the absence of a government maps onto the level of psychological dynamics and interpersonal relationships. If you mean, are we not giving up control of children, authoritarian control, the answer is happily yes. If you mean, does this mean that children will run wild without any sense of moral purpose or direction? The answer is absolutely not. In fact, children tend to act out in a bad way, to misbehave, to do what is disturbing, mostly in households where they have been over-controlled with punishments and rewards. When children are loved unconditionally, that doesn't mean we don't offer guidance. It doesn't mean we don't offer direction and help. It means we spend time working with children rather than doing things to them to make them obey.
Here's a quotation from yourself. You said, imposing a penalty is not at all likely to be a constructive thing, end of quotation. But I know lots of people that could say, penalty is the very root of a normal strategy of raising a kid.
If by normal you mean typical, I'm afraid you're correct. If you mean healthy or desirable, again, absolutely no. A penalty says, a punishment says, When you do something bad has to be done to you. The message that a child hears from a punitive parent is, do this or here's what I will do to you. I will make you suffer in some way, and that is supposed to make you a better person. When you think about it that way, when you strip bare our assumptions and our backgrounds and just look at it logically, there's no reason why making someone suffer would improve that person morally or psychologically or any other way. What it teaches children is people who have more power than I can use that power to hurt me, to make them do whatever, make me do whatever they want. That has never in the history of humankind made people more ethical and more caring. All it does is make them more self-centered, because now they think, what do I have to do in order to avoid the penalty from this person with more power?
Right.
And so if we say we don't hit people, some people, it's a tragic irony, may even hit the child. We don't hit people. I mean, this would be funny if it weren't so tragic. When we're modeling, we're setting the example of using violence. But even when we use other kinds of penalties, where we deprive children of things they enjoy, foods, privileges, chance to, because they disobeyed us, because they did something late, they were disrespectful, they hurt someone else. This doesn't lead children to ask, what kind of person do I want to be? It leads them to ask, how do I avoid getting caught? How do I do exactly what I want to do without getting the consequence? Because the consequence is to me. So the use of penalty, however common it might be, fixes children's attention firmly on their own self-interest and makes them less concerned about the impact of their actions on other people.
I'll give you two examples that you use. You will go now to your room. This is a penalty. Is it as efficient, as effective as some could believe?
Well, people who are more traditional would say it's not punitive enough because the child might enjoy being in her room, which makes me crazy to hear a criticism like this. No, we have to hurt the child more effectively. That's not enough suffering.
Right.
You know, let's assume that the child doesn't want to be deprived of company, doesn't want to be alone, finds that fearful or unpleasant, so that it is an effective penalty. Does the child, what does the child think sitting there alone in the room? Does the child think, now I see that hurting people is wrong? I mean, it's laughable. Why would we ever do this? What does the child think about? Maybe, this is so unfair. I'm always blamed for it, and my mom never sees that my sister was goading me into doing this. I'm always the one that's blamed. Or the child thinks, I'm just not a very good person. Apparently I'm not worth spending time with. That's why they keep sending me here to be by myself. Or maybe the child just thinks, I am going to get my sister when my parents aren't looking. No possible result of this is constructive and useful.
And there's also a quotation from yourself, which I find really very spectacular in terms of understanding. You said, much more important than what we feel for our children is the way they perceive these feelings and the way we treat them. Can you please comment upon this?
If you ask parents, do you love your child unconditionally? Almost every parent would say, of course. But that doesn't matter, because what predicts to certain outcomes for children is not our intentions as the adult, but the perception of the action of the person to whom the action was done. This is true in all areas of human life, for managers with employees, for teachers with students, and with parents to children. What empirically leads to certain effects are the ways that a given behavior is understood and interpreted by the person to who experiences the behavior. And in fact, one interesting research study questioned young adults and asked, did you sometimes feel that your parents loved you conditionally? That you had to earn their love by being good in school, by being well-behaved in front of their friends, or whatever? And a substantial portion of them said, absolutely, yes. So then the researchers said, was that effective? And it turned out that sometimes it was at getting temporary compliance. Sometimes the children who were made desperate for their parents' approval worked harder in school or tried hard to be good in sports or tried to pretend they weren't angry or whatever would make their parents happy. But the long-term effects were very disturbing. The children who felt they had to earn their parents' love by doing whatever were now more resentful of their parents and alienated from them as young adults. They didn't want to spend time with them. And they felt psychologically unfree. They felt as if they were being controlled from inside. The motivation was internal, but it was not fully owned and integrated. So they weren't able to take pleasure from their own accomplishments. So when you ask, does conditional parenting or do rewards and punishments work? Are they effective? The answer is that they can be effective only to get one thing, which is temporary obedience, but at a huge cost to the psychological well-being of the child.
There's also something that, I don't know, this can be pronounced also in a light manner, as half joke, let's say. And this is, if you do something like this, I don't love you anymore. What's the consequence of this?
Well, that's what I've been talking about up until now. That's conditional parenting. Number one, the child may infer, perhaps correctly, that it's not really a joke. But number two, exactly that message in earnest might be inferred when it's not even said explicitly. The child just has to watch the parent pull away, if not physically, then emotionally, when the child does something wrong, as if you're turning off the affection, as if it were a switch, a volume knob, you know? Or conversely, and this is just as destructive, turn up the affection, the big smile, the hug, the high five, the thumbs up, when the child does something that pleases the parent. And that teaches the message, I have to do this in order for my parents to really care about me. But care that has to be earned isn't worthy of being called care.
You say in your book that there are kids and teenagers that can develop a false self by pretending, and then said that, by pretending they are somebody that could be loved by their parents and not themselves.
Right. So in other words, children by a certain age get a sense of what they have to do in order to be pleasing to their parents.
Right.
And that may mean being nice or pretending to be nice to everyone even when they're not feeling it. Or it may mean being the smartest person in class. Or it may be having a funny joke to make my parents laugh. Or it could be any number of things. But slowly, in order to get that desperately needed parental approval and affection, they begin to take on that role as if they were an actor in a play. And when you do that long enough, you lose sight of who you really are underneath that role. And it takes people sometimes decades, maybe a lot of psychotherapy, to realize it's all been an act. And parents unwittingly cause that phoniness, that alienation from one's true self by demanding that children act the way the parent wants the child to be.
Let's talk a little bit about power versus love. Doing my homework for our meeting, I saw a conference on the internet with an outstanding expert in psychology and parenting, and he was talking about, and I quote, calm and confident authority, about gaining and losing points of authority. in your point of view, this is like taming animals or something like that. Can you please talk about this?
Well, the traditional approach to parenting is that to be the parent is to attain and retain control over the children. And some people say we do it in an old-fashioned, harsh way, which may include physical violence over children, which teaches children to use violence. We have unmistakable evidence now that children who are spanked or hit, slapped by their parents become depressed and become aggressive, taking advantage of whoever has less power than they do, maybe another child that same afternoon.
I will interrupt you just for 1 second. Somebody could say, well, in the world you can find also kind and normal spanking.
I'm not sure how physical violence with small children could ever be kind or normal.
I fully agree.
I mean, to me, as sickened as I am by the idea of men hitting their wives or girlfriends, I find it far worse to talk about adults hitting children under any circumstances and for any reason. But people who don't share that value judgment of mine need only look at the scientific evidence to see compelling data showing the uniformly destructive effect on the child of being hit. What it teaches, the lesson it teaches, is when you have more power than someone else, you can hurt them to get your way. And that is the lesson that corporal punishment teaches. But even parents who would never dream of taking a hand to a child and would, in the word of the expert you quote, use calm and confident power that doesn't require hitting, may nevertheless be teaching the same message. It's just power by a different means. I can have power over you and also screw you up pretty well by simply withdrawing my love from you when you displease me. Sometimes that can be even more alarming to a child, terrifying even, than if I got a spanking. Because, you know, I'm still learning. This is a relationship that is basically about control. What do I have to do to bring back my mother or father and be in their good graces again? And the same is true of other forms of punishment, what's called time out, which is a euphemistic term for the forcible isolation of young children when they need us most. But the problem I try to argue in my book is not just with the technique of getting control. I'm not saying use a timeout instead of a spanking. I'm not saying be calmer in your imposition of force and power. I'm asking people to reconsider the goal of a relationship that is based primarily on power and control. And again, to come back to something you asked earlier, that doesn't mean that the child can do whatever he wants and we just watch. This is a false dichotomy, an either-or that is set up disingenuously by traditionalists. If we don't have calm and confident power, if we don't use penalties, then we are permissive. Then anything goes, and it's a laissez-faire approach to parenting, which is completely false. The alternative to what I call a doing-to approach to parenting, involving conditional affection, punishments, rewards, power, is not doing nothing. The alternative is a working with approach where when children do something that troubles us, we don't see it as an infraction to be punished. We see it as a problem to be solved together. And I don't have a simple recipe to say, when your child does this, you stand here and you say the following in this tone of voice. And the second time he does it, you say this. I mean, this kind of one-size-fits-all recipe is disrespectful to both children and parents, because how we respond will depend on many different features of the situation.
Lots of people will ask for a recipe.
Of course. That's the nice thing about punishments and rewards. They don't require time, talent, care, or courage, because you never have to question your own requests. That's what most parenting books and seminars begin with, the premise that anything you want as the parent is legitimate. Now, I will give you some tricks to make it happen. And that's very convenient for us. I come along and I say, maybe when the child doesn't do what you say, the problem is with what you say. Maybe the request is not reasonable or developmentally appropriate for the child. Maybe it's more for your own convenience than it is to meet the child's needs. I'm interested in families where the question parents tend to ask is, what does my child need, and how can I meet those needs? That's very different from the question, how do I get my child to do what I want? And the vast majority of books on parenting ask the second question without even making it explicit.
I have some very good close friends who have, let's say, not very typical, but let's say not very adaptive kids. They have kids who are a little bit hyperactive, noisy, maybe somehow physically aggressive towards objects or even to other kids. Is there a strategy in order to get a different result? I don't know how to express it.
Yeah, I understand, but I want to split your question into two. It's not the same to talk about a kid who is unusually energetic and hyperactive. Should not be confused with a child who is aggressive to other people. The first may be completely healthy, just sometimes inconvenient for us.
Right.
And when parents ask, I want children who are quiet, who don't make a mess, who don't make a lot of noise, I say to them, maybe you should have been raising tropical fish instead of raising children. This comes with the territory, So if the question is, how do I make my child who's 5 years old sit through a long family dinner, I say the request is not legitimate. That's not what a 5-year-old can do. And if you manage to force him, it's going to be at the expense of either his healthiness or your relationship with him, or both. But it's very different to talk about a child who hurts another child. That is a problem. And that we try to address by helping the child to see that hurting people is wrong because of its impact on the other child. If you punish a child who is aggressive, if you send him to his room, if you take away a toy, if you yell and shame, if you slap.
You're visiting friends and you send him to your car, for example.
Yeah, that's right. You can't stay there anymore. This doesn't teach children to be less aggressive. This comes back to what we were talking about earlier. This just teaches a lesson of power. The reason not to hurt people is if I'm caught at it, I will be made to suffer. That child hasn't been made less aggressive, more sensitive, more moral. That's why we have to help the child see that the problem with hurting people is what it does to the other child. So I might say to a young child, you remember when you were running very fast down the stairs last week and you tripped and you hurt your leg and you cried? I think that's the way you might have made John feel. What do you think you can do now to make him feel better? So we induce the child to consider the impact of his action. We draw his attention to how it affected someone else. That's very different from, you've made Papa very angry. And now I learn I can't be the way I like to be around you, not that I hurt other people. And we see the results of a punitive approach with parents who punish children for being aggressive. The people grow up to be just as aggressive and just as self-centered, if not more. And sometimes they apply that to other people in subtle ways and sometimes not so subtle. And here's a point that many people don't understand. We think the alternative to punishing people for doing what's wrong is to give them rewards or praise when they do it right. To say, good job, I really like the way you were so quiet and helpful and obedient. I really like it when you're well behaved. Have a sticker, have some candy. This is no better. This is still a doing to approach, not a working with approach. It's still about pleasing the parent. It's still about conditional affection, right? Positive reinforcement. It doesn't mean I love you no matter what. It means I seem to love you only when you please me. Or worse, when you please me not for being spirited and curious, but for please me for being like a piece of furniture. You know, where we seem to prize docility and compliance. So the goal is wrong and the method is wrong if we want to raise children who are healthy and curious and ethical and happy.
How will you translate in terms of psychology the real reaction of one of my real friends talking about spanking, talking about different types of parents? And I quote, "I was spanked, but that was good. That was very good because it gave results. And I appreciate this now." End of quotation.
Well, let's start with the word results and then move to the word appreciate. The second one troubles me more.
Right.
Empirically, we can show that the results that this gives is only temporary obedience. And as I mentioned, with very disturbing long-term implications for how we look at other people, being self-centered versus compassionate, being ethical in any sophisticated way versus a very simplistic moral code. What does it do to our psychological health, our view of ourselves? All of this very clear. The results are uniformly disturbing beyond getting the child who's fearful to sit down and shut up. It also tends to create people who are fearful of their own parents. Not respectful in any meaningful sense of that word, unless we define respect to mean terrified. But the saddest part of this comment is that the person apparently has internalized this warped way of treating people to actually not even be able to rebel, to have fully taken in, swallowed in, the psychologists call it introjected, this view that this was good for me and I benefited from it. Part of this, I think, is because we are desperate to believe, even on an unconscious level, that our parents wanted nothing but the best for us and did everything they did out of love. Here I'm borrowing from the work of the psychoanalyst Alice Miller. And we are so desperate to believe that, so afraid of questioning that premise, that we have to believe it makes sense, and to prove it, I will do the same to my children. It can take enormous courage to take a step back and say, this was wrong. This did me no favors. I can forgive my parents for this lapse, but first I have to recognize it as a lapse.
Yep. What do you think about homework and competition within school? I mean, I do have to tell you that Romania is part of the educational system where pupils have hard and very consistent homework. What is your opinion about that? I will also give you a perfectly real example of people solving tens or even hundreds of math problems in the summer holiday, for example.
I've written another book about this. I wrote it the next year after Unconditional Parenting. It's called The Homework Myth. It's not available in Romanian yet, I can say, hopefully, which reviews the research on homework. The disadvantages are clear to any child or former child, which is that homework is almost uniformly despised by children. It tends to make them frustrated, exhausted, takes away time from the things they care about and give them pleasure after having spent a whole day in school Now they have to begin what amounts to a second shift, you know, when they get home. And it tends to make children less excited about learning. Homework may be the single greatest extinguisher of curiosity yet invented. So now the question is, are there powerful advantages to it to compensate for the obvious disadvantages? And the answer is no. I've read all the studies, scientific studies I can get my hands on. The first thing they show is no benefit academically at all for children who are below about age 15. To the best of my knowledge, no research has ever found any benefit to any kind of homework for younger children. Even for older children in secondary school, very questionable. There is only a mild correlation, statistical association between doing more homework and having higher scores on certain tests, but it's not clear that the homework caused the higher scores, because you can imagine that certain other variables might have led to both. Plus, test scores are not a particularly good indicator of meaningful intellectual proficiencies. That's a whole other book, is why standardized tests do not make sense. Moreover, no benefit has been found in other ways of homework. The idea that it causes kids to learn good study skills, independence, self-discipline, no research supports this folk wisdom. So basically it turns out that homework is all pain and no gain.
What about competition?
And that's yet another book. And that probably should be a program in its own right, because that's a complicated and controversial topic that applies at school, at home, at work, and at play, and to our whole society.
I will stop you for 1 second. I have a friend in Great Britain. He has a very nice family. He works in the elite of acoustic jobs with, I don't know, electronic things, playing music. And he said something like this: there's no more competition in the school of my kids, and I'm really desperate. It is a threat to the basis of our tradition and to our civilization. End of quotation.
Well, he lives in a different world than I do, or perhaps has different values in terms of what we want to promote. Me, I want to promote excellence as well as caring, loving people. And competition gets in the way of both. If you are an obstacle to my success, I can succeed only if you fail, or only if I make you fail, which is what competition means by definition. Then I have every interest in making sure that you are a loser. And research finds that I tend to celebrate your pain. And I am less empathic, less likely to help you, to trust you, or to communicate openly with you. But even if your goal was only excellence, people who could achieve at high levels, it turns out that all of us are smarter than any of us, which is to say that a well-functioning cooperative group reaches higher levels of achievement than the most expert member of that group could on his or her own, and certainly does better than a situation where we have to step on each other's faces in order to get ahead. The great achievements of our civilization are in spite of competition, not because of it, and ideally in a situation where we're all rooting for each other and exchanging our resources and talents to cooperate, not to compete.
Is there a unique model or a pattern for all kids regarding the culture or the ethnic group they will come from? I mean, this type of theory can apply to everybody?
In its broad outlines, yes, but in the way that it's applied, it might be different.
I'll give you an example. A Romanian who sees you right now can say, well, Alfie Kohn is fascinating, but that works at his home in the States. That will never work in Romania. This is totally different.
Well, the empirical research that I've been referring to has been done across cultural bounds. For example, the idea that conditional parenting is destructive and that children need to have a sense of control over their own lives, that it makes more sense to work with kids instead of doing to kids, that result has been ratified and reproduced in countries all across, all across Europe, in North America, in Asia, in more collective societies and in more individualistic societies. Now, what isn't uniform is the way one might work with children. Because there it will depend not only on the culture, but on the individual child and his or her temperament and personality. That's why I hesitate to give a simple, fixed solution. What do I do when my child does the following? Yep. Here, I think there are different responses. But what never works in any culture or with any child is to rely on power and control, punishments and rewards. And I have not heard any logical reason nor seen any evidence that unconditional support for children isn't what they need around the globe.
What will you answer to somebody who can say, if I follow your point of view, if I follow your research, if I follow your book, this is like I will become the slave of my kid.
Yes, here we go back to the anarchy canard, you know, the false, the straw man in an argument. If you believe that human relationships must be master and slave relationships necessarily, then it makes sense that if you're not the master, you must be the slave. Happily, that view of the world is mistaken through and through. Right. What we want is for no one to be a master or a slave. I'm not saying we're equal to children. We have more experience. We have, we hope, more wisdom. I'm not saying that it's the same as you and I talking. I believe the parent has unique responsibilities to guide and help children to acquire values and then to decide what values they want for themselves, to keep them safe and so on. It's not permissiveness and it's not total equality in my view. But it does mean a relationship built on mutual respect. And I believe human beings deserve respect and compassion and to have some say about their lives from their earliest days. I worry about people who equate that with becoming the slave of a child.
One last question. What will you answer to that? Alfie Kohn is good. He seems to be an innovator. His theories are fascinating, but they have no practical support. They're just fascinating conference topics, but with no relevance in real life.
I don't know how to... First of all, I draw these theories not in a vacuum. I didn't think of this stuff in the shower this morning. This comes from real life and from scientific research that ends up ratifying and supporting it. As for its practical application, I mean, I can show you all the lovely notes I get from people who read this and say, this approach transformed my family, and I always say, I didn't do that, you did that, but I'm glad to have called you back to your own best instincts as a parent. And on the other hand, I'm hardly the only person. I'm standing on the shoulders of people who've been writing and thinking, psychotherapists and researchers and wise people who don't do this professionally, but have found that their children respond to unconditional love. This works better in the real world than traditional control-based theories. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can not only watch this happen in your friends' households if they're farther along in this journey, you can watch and ask your own child.